what's up? This is Steve from Oath, and you're watching Metal DNA. So I'm going to talk today about the new wave of British heavy metal, or NWOBHM, as we'll call it from now on, because it's just quicker. I first got introduced to the NWOBHM by falling in love really with Iron Maiden, who still to this day are my favourite band. And at that time, kind of when I got into Maiden, you sort of read as much as you could about them, reading magazines, reading books, and they would introduce you to all these other bands that were in this new wave of British heavy metal. So you heard about Saxon, you heard about Def Leppard, and then they were kind of the bigger bands, and then you sort of start to delve a little bit deeper, and you found bands like Praying Mantis, Angel Witch, Witchfinder General, Witchfind, and it was just there was thousands of bands just coming out at this time to kind of set the scene a little bit in the UK at the time. So you're talking kind of the late 70s that it started, and it kind of peaked probably around 81, 82. At that time, there was kind of a lot of kind of upheaval in the UK at the time politically. There was a lot going on as well, a lot of unrest, a lot of unhappiness, people feeling kind of disenfranchised. Some shit never changes, right? In the UK at the time, the punk movement happened. So you had guys like the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the Damned, and that kind of injected it was a little shot in the arm for the music scene in the UK at the time. It introduced a lot of speed into the music, literally as well as figuratively, but it also introduced an element of do-it-yourself, which is something that's very important to me actually. The kind of music that I make, being able to just make your own album, make your own single. No one had really done that before. Everyone relied on labels, giving them money to do it, and the punk bands just went, nah, fuck that, we'll just do it, we'll do it ourselves. And that attitude was a big influence on the new wave of British heavy metal bands, because they loved, Deep Purple, they loved Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, but it was miles away from them. It wasn't achievable for them. Whereas printing up your own single, like some of the punk bands did, was something that they could do. They could save up, they could get a little bit of money to make a little demo tape in a studio and sell it at gigs. And it was just this kind of do-it-yourself attitude that you didn't have to be a virtuoso to be in a band. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of the guys that were in the new wave of British heavy metal were great players, but a lot of them were kind of average, and a lot of it just, they relied on attitude and just the desire to do it. And that's, for me, that's part of the charm of the genre. The fact that you've just got guys going for it and having an absolute blast, and I think you can hear that in all the great NWOBHM albums. Just this kind of desire to get their music across and to go out and have fun and to try and make something of themselves. For me, that's what I love about the NWOBHM. Obviously you've got the big successful bands that came out of it, Maiden, Leppard, Saxon, but for me the interest is more in the bands that didn't make it, because there's a kind of charm and a romance about that. And I think the fact that the bands are still doing it today, you've still got Diamond Head touring, you've still got Vardis touring, and these guys, they're not making crazy amounts of money, they don't have huge record deals or anything, but they're just purely doing it because they love to do it. They couldn't quit, and they did for a period in the 90s where it got hard, I guess, but they came back because they just couldn't stay away from it. And yeah, I think that's what I love about it. Just these kind of guys from working class towns, because 9 times out of 10 they were from working class backgrounds. A lot of the punks they kind of portrayed this image of working classness, but most of them weren't. Most of them were kind of art school dropouts and stuff, rebelling against mum and dad. But the new wave of British heavy metal guys were literally, it was, you either had, the band either was successful or you were going to work in a pit for the rest of your life like your dad did, until they closed down the mines, and then you had nothing. That's kind of how it was in Britain in those days. And you can hear that again in the music, that just almost a desperation to not do what was expected of them. And that's where my fascination with the new album comes in. The other thing that's interesting about the new British heavy metal for me is how many different genres of music it was responsible for. I honestly think you can trace back all modern metal music right back to the new British heavy metal. You may think that's a bold statement, but let's look at all the genres that came from just one band. And I'm talking about Venom. So Venom came from the northeast of England, not too far away from where I live actually. We're kind of on the border with England. So Venom came out of Newcastle, and let's be fair, they weren't great players. They came out of the punk scene, but they had pure anger, energy, and just this kind of desire to mess with people's heads, I think, a little bit, and to piss off parents. And they did it so well. And they took the kind of, I suppose Sabbath started and Coven started the whole kind of satanic thing, but Venom really took it over the top with the, the priest image, with the leather and the chains, and just the downright evilness. And if you look at Venom, the amount of bands that would not have existed without them is incredible. Metallica don't exist without Venom. Megadeth, Slayer, Death, Possessed, none of that really exists without Venom. And then they influenced Celtic Frost massively, and if you don't have Celtic Frost, how many bands don't you have? The Norwegian black metal scene doesn't exist without Venom. No way. They invented black metal, death metal, thrash metal, all invented by one little band from the northeast of England, who everyone laughed at the time. Venom were not taken seriously when they came out. They were considered to be a joke band. For me, probably the most influential band to come out of the new wave of British heavy metal, apart from Iron Maiden. But actually, you might even say Venom was more so because of how far-reaching their influence was, and how it went into so many different genres, and became the genesis for all these kind of different genres of metal. So that you can say that about lots of other bands. You look at Metallica and the influence that was on them from just really unknown bands like Jaguar. Their album Mind Games is a great album. It's fast. It's a fast record. And actually, fun enough, talking about Venom and Jaguar as well, they came out of the Neat Records scene. So Neat was a record label from the northeast, from Newcastle. And just the amount of bands that were on Neat Records is insane. There was almost like a mini New. In fact, there was the new wave of British heavy metal, and then it was the northeastern new wave of British heavy metal, the New album. Now that's not a catchy title at all. But then out of that you had Venom, of course, Atomkraft, Tyson Dog, Tigers of Pantan, White Spirit, Black Rose, tons and tons of bands, and just coming out of this fairly small area. And again, it's a really, really working class area. At that time, certainly, there was very working class. There was not a lot of prospects, a lot of unemployment. And I think that's got something to do with why there were so many of those bands. It was you either made it as a musician or you made it as a footballer, and those were kind of the two options open to you. Failing that, it was manual labour till you died. And again, you can hear that in those bands' music, definitely. So yeah, for me, that's what's interesting about the new album. And I think now, even you look at the influence that it had, and now look at the new bands that are coming up now, like Oath, and you'll hear bands like Haunt, well, any band that's kind of associated with making old school heavy metal now, it goes back to those kind of bands. Angel Witch being a huge influence. I think even like a band that doesn't get enough credit is Witchfinder General. For me, this might be a controversial statement, but for me, they invented doom metal. So I know everyone's going to say, no, that was Sabbath. But when I say that, I mean Sabbath. Sure, they invented doom, but doom metal, I would say, was Witchfinder General were the first ones to really do that. Because they stripped out all the kind of the frills that Sabbath would have had, the kind of acoustic moments, the keyboards, the slightly proggier element that Sabbath took along further towards their career. Witchfinder General stripped that out. They put naked ladies on the cover, and they made meaty big riffs about beer, and were hugely influential in that process. Influenced bands like Cathedral, and then I guess obviously bands like Paradise Lost as well, bands like Candlemass would probably be citing Witchfinder General as an influence. And again, a band that just got no credit, really, made a couple of albums and got forgotten about. And you listen back to those records now, to me anyway, they still stand up. They really stand up against some of the best that's out just now. A band like Angel Witch as well, another band who just disappeared for years and came back in recent times, and their last 2 records were absolutely killer. These guys just seem to know how to do it better. For me, it's a songwriting thing. It wasn't always about the riffs or the speed, it was about songs. And there's so many great songs looking back, so many great singles too, bands that like never really did much, like a band like Persian Risk, for example, who's probably are most famous for supplying Motorhead with a guitar player, but they had this great song called Calling for You. I can't remember the name of the song, but it was a great catchy song. Loads of bands like that. So yeah, for me, the new wave of British heavy metal is, if I had to pick a favourite genre or a sub-genre of metal, that's what I'm going to pick for that reason. I think I relate to it, coming from where I live is a pretty working class area. And I think these bands, even though it was 30 years ago, it's still really relatable today. And a lot of the bands did sing about kind of slightly more esoteric. A lot of the lyrics were kind of just your standard beer, women, heavy metal. But you had bands like Fist, for example, from Newcastle, or the northeast at least, who were singing about being on the dole and just how kind of shitty it was being a young person at that time, how few prospects you had. There weren't many bands in metal doing that at the time, as there still aren't, and never has been. So it's interesting to go back and dig into that aspect of it. So yeah, that's all I've got to say about the new British heavy metal. If you've not dug into that genre at all, I can highly recommend that you listen to Angel Witch's first record. You should obviously already know Iron Maiden, Saxon, Def Leppard. If you don't, you're probably watching the wrong show. Praying Mantis's first record, and I would recommend by the Tigers of Pantang, Caged, their record. Oh no, sorry, The Cage. That's one of my songs. The Cage is a great record by them. Mind Games by Jaguar. The first 2 Venom records, doesn't matter what one you pick, they're both amazing. Also an album called Bloodsport by a band called Avenger. But then just dig into the whole genre and just listen to them all, because although it was under one kind of banner, one movement, they're all totally different. There's not really that many bands in the new wave of British heavy metal that sound the same. They all had something different going on about them. They all had like a different kind of vibe to them, and you'll always get that kind of punky element in there, that kind of speeded up little vibe, that kind of rawness and urgency. And it's something that I would say is missing from like modern metal. It's really, modern metal is so well produced now, and everything's pro tooled out of its box, and there's very little of that element of just going in a room and playing a guitar and playing a set of drums and playing a bass and singing until the song's finished and just playing it all the way through. So if you want to hear that, that's what you're going to hear in the new wave of British heavy metal. And I've rambled enough, so we're done now. Thank you and good night.